Welcome, everybody. My name is Trudy Coxe, and I'm the CEO of the Preservation Society of Newport County. And today we are inside the Newport Mansions with a very special guest, Dr. Myra Armstead. Dr. Armstead is the Lyford Patterson Edwards and Helen Gray Edwards Professor of Historical Studies at Bard College and the Senior Advisor to the President of Bard. She specializes in U.S. social and cultural history with emphasis on urban and African American history. She holds a BA from Cornell and an MA and PhD from the University of Chicago. She has written several books, including Memory and Enslavement, Schuyler House, Old Saratoga, and the Saratoga Patent in History, Historical Practice, and the Historical Imagination, which was published in 2023. Freedom's Gardener, James F. Brown Horticulture and the Hudson Valley in Antebellum America. Mighty Change, Tall Within, Black Identity in the Hudson Valley. And then, Lord, Please Don't Take Me in August, African Americans in Newport and Saratoga Springs. And that last title is one of the things that prompted us to reach out to Dr. Armstead in hopes that she would be able to come and speak to us here in Newport. And in fact, she will be our featured lecturer at an upcoming lecture here at Rosecliff on the 6th of June. I hope that all of you who are listening will plan to sign up. It will be live and on the internet, so please join us if you can via Zoom. You can go to the website newportmansions.org and learn more. The title of Dr. Armstead's lecture on the 6th of June at Rosecliff is Eclectic and Independent, Black Self-Advocacy Strategies, 1870 to 1930. So what an impressive resume you have, Myra. Thank you very, very much for being with us this morning.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here.
I have looked at your resume and certainly learned a little bit more about you. And what I think is so fascinating is your own family history. And I think it would be great if you could tell us a little bit about yourself. You grew up in the Borscht Belt region of the Catskills. You are an expert on African heritage communities throughout the Northeast. Your grandparents relocated from a farm in Virginia to the Catskills. I'm going to leave it there and let you tell us your story.
Well, oh my goodness, it's a long story, but I'll say a couple of things about how that story intersected with the book, that last book. I was aware in going into that research, which was really my dissertation and my first book, that I had intellectual scholarly questions about resort towns. Growing up in a resort town, I subjectively, I had all sorts of memories of that, but I did not know that one could frame a question, a scholarly question about that. And I suppose as a child and a teenager, the thing that made me the most curious about where I lived was the relationship of the resort town to the city, because everybody was from the city, quote unquote, which was New York and its immediate environs. And the symbiosis between resort towns and larger cities was a question that I had. And really, I kind of longed as a child to be more urban or to have more of the city. So I think that's sort of where I started. And then when I was in graduate school and focused on urban history, which was a relatively new field, there was not much on resort towns. And my advisor, who was one of the pioneers in that field, suggested that I look into it. And so I did, and I found that Newport and several other communities were major resort communities and ended up selecting Newport and Saratoga to focus on. So I would say that initially I had uh, proto academic questions as a kid. They became sharpened by a literature when I was in grad school, but it really wasn't until the very end when I was finishing up the book and had to write an introduction. You know, you write an introduction, but then when you finish the book, you go back and do an introduction, a
A new
proper,
introduction.
yes. I realized how deeply autobiographical it was, and how and it's almost amazing to me that I didn't have that sharp an awareness of how personal this was to me. But I think that was necessary in terms of the kinds of questions that I ended up asking. So yeah, that's the connection to.
Well, there's so much to talk about because, as you know, Myra, Newport is very much a resort town, and we have, and I'm sure this is true, both along the Hudson Valley and in the Catskills. There's a love-hate relationship about tourism, as you know, and about our history. And one day we love it, and the next day we don't. So we could talk, I think, for hours upon hours. I do want you to talk a little bit, though, before we get into the topic, about your grandparents. How did they come from Virginia to the Catskills? Because that is, I suspect, an important part of connection for you.
Yeah, just like so many 19th century Black Newporters, they came from Virginia. My grandparents were part of the Great Migration of Blacks in the 20th century between 1915 and 1970 to the north. They came during the Depression, the Great Depression. They owned a farm in Surry County, which was on the James River, a really pleasant, interesting community in of itself, another whole subject. But they had a lot of kids, and my grandfather, who was a hustler, a good hustler, was finding it difficult to make ends meet. He had the mail route for the town, the little town of Claremont, but he was underbid in those days, at least in Claremont. The mail was delivered by someone who bid with, I guess, the government to deliver the mail. It being the Depression, naturally somebody underbid him. He also had a little, I would say, a bodega-like store, a general store, serving a Black clientele. But there was another one, and in the Depression, my grandfather found that his competitor was doing better. So they were really struggling at the same time that uh, coincided with a personal tragedy in 2 years back to back. They lost, my grandparents, maternal grandparents lost two of their sons, one in a truck accident at the age of 19, fell off the back of a truck and suffered serious internal injuries. And then the second one in a drowning accident in the James River. His body was never found. My grandmother was very distraught and was really having a nervous breakdown, losing weight. I heard these stories growing up. And right at that time, a good friend of theirs who lived in the town approached her and said, Maggie, that was her name, how would you like to earn some extra money working as a maid for the Flagler Hotel, which was in the Borscht Belt? My grandfather and the family doctor consulted, and they thought this was the best idea anyone could think of. And so my grandmother came. She picks up the story, or picked it up. I heard it many times, that as she was taking the bus from New York City up to the mountains, she was so struck by the beauty. She said, I've got to get Gratney, that was my grandfather's name, and the kids here. And within a few months, They managed that. Now, if you know anything about the Great Migration, um, very often there was chain migration, networks of people who knew each other, and churches were central in that. And it turns out that my grandfather was an elder in their particular denomination that was starting up a church of Virginians in Harlem. So that aided their relocation. So what they did was develop a strategy very quickly where every summer my grandmother would come to the Catskills and work as a maid. My grandfather and the kids, the base was Harlem. And he had all sorts of jobs at the, Brooklyn Navy Yard. He became a licensed barber. He was an ordained minister. He was a super for a building, anything to save money. And the kids, once they became teenagers, found summer jobs, they pulled their money. And within 9 years, they bought property up in the Catskills and converted this simple little home into a 38-bedroom lodging house
Hmm.
for summer workers, Black summer workers who came from the South, but also in my memory in the 50s from Jamaica, from Cuba, from Puerto Rico, people of color who would have difficulty finding housing. So, and then on top of that, so that was their main business. All right. That was the main business. But granddaddy, being enterprising, also had a barber shop. And on Sundays, there was service. That wasn't a business. But if you were a person of color, that household, the Gratney M. Smith household, was a place you had to stop at. My grandmother opened a hand laundry for the tourists. And like most small businesses, they made their money, they raked it in the summertime. And then, you just sort of manage the money until the next summer.
That's incredible. And what both of them were so adaptable and so entrepreneurial and diversified. Really, men and women of all trades, Renaissance people, if you will. It's pretty impressive. And then, so during the winter, they would go not back to Virginia, or they would go to Harlem.
Well, before I was born, they would go to Harlem, and because that was their home. And from what I understand, there were like successive moves in Harlem, always to a better place. And I find this funny that the last place they moved to was the Bronx, which was considered a move, an upward move. But
Yeah.
they weren't there for too long. I don't think it was like more than a couple of years before all of the renovations and the construction of the house in the Catskill was finished. And, both of my grandparents grew up on farms in Virginia that their families owned, which was, I think, unusual. And my grandfather, I remember, seemed to be able to do everything. So I haven't, unfortunately, I didn't ask these questions before when I should have, before the people died. But I think my grandfather built a lot of that himself. Because I have memories of him pouring concrete and doing carpentry and construction work on the house, but it was repairing things. So he probably also, with I don't know who helped him, but he got 38 bedrooms.
That's pretty impressive. And then, did your parents continue on in keeping this boarding house going, or where did they fit into, and where did you fit in?
Okay, so this was the deal. My grandparents' children all graduated high school in the city, in New York. And let's see, I think it was 1947 or 1948 that they moved completely to the Catskills. My mother, of all of her sisters and brothers, was the homebody. She just loved her parents. So she stayed there year round after she graduated high school sometime. I think right after World War II, so 46, something like that. 40, I don't know, maybe 44. And my father was a World War II veteran from North
Mhm.
Carolina. And he had left the South out of disgust. He came back from the war. He was trying to use the GI Bill to further his education, and he had a plan. And we know that the GI Bill was not, there was racial discrimination in its application. And so his plan wasn't approved. And he was so upset about that he decided, as he put it, I can hear him, I decided to follow my economical, what did he say, interests or whatever. So he went to New York and was very excited about it. He, the thing is that he wanted to use a GI Bill for vocational education because I think he only had finished 8th grade. And so he didn't have, he wasn't well educated in a formal sense. So he was working at various odd jobs in the city. A friend of his told him that he could make a lot of money in the summer if he went to the Catskills and worked as a waiter. He had to make his way to the Gratnium Smith house,
Oh, yeah.
for a haircut. And I remember him telling the story, and I saw your mother. And and they started dating. He went back to the city. And within a couple of years, they got married. And they got married in the city because even though my mother had moved with her family, their social world was still very much connected to friends in Harlem.
Mhm.
And so, okay, so that was my dad. Now he wanted to move back to the city, but my mother, I guess, convinced him that it made sense for them to stay. So the year-round people, you either had to have a retail operation that was essential,
Year-round people in the Catskills.
in the
Yeah.
Catskills, you
Similar
know,
to Newport, I think, what you're going to tell us, I think.
absolutely. So, I remember when I was small in the very tiny hamlet, there were a couple of shoe stores, a pharmacy, we called it a supermarket, but it wasn't, but mom and pop stores that were essential, or you had to be a professional, or you had to work for the government or civil service. So my father was very fortunate as a Black man he worked as a janitor for the high school, which was being built, very much a part of the post-war baby boom when high school populations were expanding. And that's what he did. And he also had a second job, which enabled my mother to stay at home, which is what they both wanted with the kids. And what was the second job? Oh, yes, there was a vending company that supplied candy and whatever to
Mhm.
vending machines, and he was a driver for that. So that's what he did. And of course, everybody helped with the business. So in the summer, the business meaning the house, my grandparents' house. So there were some families that stayed year round. They decided that they were going to make their future, the young families, in the Catskills.
Mhm.
So, I remember when I was very, very small, I mean, preschool, really, but I don't know, I have this memory. Everybody says, "Oh, you remember these things," but I did. And there were a few families that were young, like my parents, and they had kids, and they stayed, and the house was fun in the winter. And then by the time I started kindergarten, in the 60s, they were moving out and buying their own houses. And then, occasionally at certain times of the year in the off season, because the Catskills, the Borscht Belt catered to a predominantly Reformed Jewish population.
Mhm.
So, Passover, certain times of the year, in the winter, in the fall, you would get an upsurge of people.
Mhm.
So, that meant that they would need helpers in the hotels. And so my grandparents would be busy again. So I like to tell people I grew up in the hospitality industry.
Yes, you did. Now, in Newport during the Gilded Age and into the turn of the century, there were African American hotels as well as white hotels. Did you see that in the Catskills as well, or was much of the population working in the hotels?
I would say most of the population was working in the hotels.
I see.
There was something that they called the Green Book.
Yes,
A
yes.
friend of mine, I mean, I encountered that book when I was doing this research for the first time in like the 80s. And a friend of mine, was fascinated by it. And she wrote the book on the Green Book, and Gretchen Soren Sullivan. But I've looked at that book, and it did list a couple of places in the Catskills, but not very big at all. And if you were a big star like Jackie Robinson, you could stay at the big hotels like Grossinger's or the Concord. But by and large, the Black people who came up were workers.
I see. So
Even my
you're
grandparents had friends who would vacation at their spot. We have some pictures of friends who I'm thinking of like friends that they knew in the 30s who were like doing well in the 50s and had moved out of the city and decided, oh, we can do a twofer. We can see our old friends and we can vacation in the Catskills. And they would stay in a different part of this boarding house was also my grandparents' home. So the front part was their home. And then in the back were the facilities for the workers. So they'd have friends stay in the front part.
aha. Sounds
Mhm.
great. Now, your lecture on the 6th of June coming up is entitled Eclectic and Independent Black Self-Advocacy Strategies, 1870 to 1930. So you are going to be talking about Black politics, I think. Talk a little bit to us about the involvement and the growth of African Americans in political activities during this period of time that you've centered on.
Well, let me start by saying Newport stood out to me in my work in contrast to, or in comparison to Saratoga Springs. I ended up choosing, you have to understand that this topic was such a novel topic way back when I was doing the research in the 80s. I mean, right now there's a huge field across the social sciences and social studies, anthropology, sociology, history, about economics, about resort towns, or the voyeuristic gaze, or, travel literature. Nothing like that existed. So I was really out there on thin ice. And I was afraid that I wouldn't find enough sources. And so I was thinking I was going to have several cities to compare. But when I went out and did preliminary research, I found that because Saratoga and Newport were so popular, there was a lot of literature, a lot written about them. And then, my task would be to try to tease out what was going on with the Black population. So I had this comparison going on. And it was, I think I was doing both together, but I got most of my information for Saratoga first. And when I got to Newport, it was so different. First of all, there were far many more sources. I found a community that was very self-aware and self-advocating. And that was happening year round. And this was very, very different from Saratoga Springs, where the community tended to just stop activity, in the off season. And it was the outsiders who came in the summer who were the change. So that really stood out to me. And as I tried to explain this difference, what I did was end up going to the colonial history of Newport and,
Yes.
and sort of learning. I mean, the book itself focused on the period from 1870 to 1930, but I necessarily went far back and, learned about the colonial Black population, about the slave trade, about the first Black, people often say that the first Black Benevolent Association was in Philadelphia, but it was actually in Newport. And,
Yes.
and so I think there was that tradition to start with, which was unusual in the North. And then when you had infusions of people like George Downing,
Yes.
you just had this kind of forward progressive force that was there year round. So that was a major difference that I picked up on, and I began to uncover evidence for in this period, in this late 19th century period.
So when you're in your book, when you talk about self-advocacy, an example.
Okay, well, integration of the public schools, or integration of the school board, that kind of thing. George Downing was involved in state politics, in
Yes.
city politics, and in national politics as well. And that kind of breadth of political engagement was impressive for me. And it was something I didn't expect to find in a resort town, a small resort town.
Well, I think one of the things that I can't wait for you to see our exhibition, Gilded Age Newport in Color, which was organized by the Rhode Island Black History Society under the leadership of both Teresa Guzman Stokes and Keith Stokes. And I think you know them, just actually are speaking here at our next lecture on the 18th of May. I think you're going to enjoy that exhibition a lot. But the thing that we come away with in seeing that exhibition, Dr. Armstead, is the I have to admit I'm a little bit embarrassed about this, but the Black population of Newport in the 1880s and 1890s and at the turn of the century was doing extremely well. These were highly professional people. They were excelling on many fronts. And it's a part of Newport's history that we are telling with this exhibition and with our lecture series, that so many Newporters are saying to us, I had no idea. I just
Well,
didn't know.
you know, that's my reaction is sort of uh, a double one. On the one hand, it's just wonderful that this exhibition is happening. But on the other hand, I'm really surprised that um, people still don't know. And because my work was done in the late 90s,
Yeah.
and then there were a couple of people, I cannot remember their names, but when I was finishing my book, I hadn't quite finished it. A couple of people at the Newport um, Historical Society worked with the community, the Newport Black community, to put on to create a book, and it culled from family photographs, and it documented visually just what we're talking about, the range of businesses and the entrepreneurship on the part of the Black community. So I would have thought, that would have somehow or another penetrated the larger population. But that's why we need historians. Because I remember when in 2005, the New York Historical Society, the big New York Historical Society off Central Park West in Manhattan, had an exhibit, Slavery in New York. That exhibit was sold out and it was held over. There were charter buses coming to that exhibit. And I remember having to do some research there one day, and I was just amazed that this was an eye-opener to people who had no idea that there was slavery in New York. So, well, kudos to you for that.
Yeah,
But
well, it is. I do understand the double impact it has, because it does strike me again and again. But this is our country right now. We are not focused on history. We don't teach history well. It's not an important topic. And boy, oh boy, if there's a time when we need history, it's right now. So hopefully we can make things change. In your book, you talk about the relationship between Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. We had a lecture on Du Bois a few weeks ago. Their relationship was strong, and then it soured. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about these two giants and what happened, and what do we learn from that falling apart of the relationship? Because those are two names that everybody knows.
yeah.
Even if you're not history oriented, everybody knows the name of Booker T. Washington, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's a history that is taught.
Right.
Well, I think that there were several reasons for the differences that emerged. Some of them were biographical, just different backgrounds, which fed into another set of differences, which were ideological. And then I think they had differences. Well, no, they had similar temperaments, which would sort of dictate that they would be at odds with each other.
Right.
So in terms of their biographies, W.E.B. Du Bois was born in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, right across the border from New York State, and small town, integrated, almost no Black people, aspired to go to Yale, and it was in the 1870s. He was born in 1868. He didn't know slavery at all. And the townsfolk raised money for him. His family, his mom especially, needed money. Another whole story there. they raised money, and he was sort of like a favorite son, and they sent him to Fisk because of the racial codes that had emerged nationally, not just in the South. But after a couple of years, he was able to transfer to Harvard and get his PhD, first Black PhD from Harvard, and experienced the best and most elite education that the country can offer. And the doctorate was a fairly new degree. And the German gymnasium was the model. Everybody was going to study in Germany. He studied in Germany, so he came back a very dedicated scholar, academic, sophisticated man who believed in
Right.
he believed in the power of education, a liberal arts education, and felt that he had grown up in an integrated world. It wasn't perfect. If you read his autobiographies, he wrote 3, but he definitely believed in integration. Now, Washington had a very different background. He was born in slavery. He was born in Virginia. He, famously walked to Hampton, which was an institution started for newly freed slaves, more of a vocational school. He got another degree from Wayland Seminary, which was a Black school. And at a very young age, 25, was appointed principal of Tuskegee, now Tuskegee University, but then a vocational school, basically. And so they had very different backgrounds. Washington grew up in the segregated South and had arisen by taking a kind of industrial vocational educational track. And he believed that these two very different life stories informed their visions for the future and how Blacks were to rise, particularly in education. And so people like Du Bois would come to be called militant integrationist. I mean, that's funny, but it's all relative, particularly after 1895, when Booker T. Washington is tapped to give this famous speech at the Atlanta Exposition, which was basically like a World's Fair in Atlanta, as the New South was being built. And he very famously gave his, he held up his 5 fingers and gave the speech that came to be called by his detractors the compromise speech, where he says, in all things purely social, we can be as separate as these 5 fingers. And so he was saying, we're not trying to go to school with you, ride trains and buses with you. We can have our own social life. And instead, he felt that the focus of the relatively recently freed Black population should be on developing very, very rudimentary skills for, I think, what he would call civilization. So there's that chapter called The Gospel of the Toothbrush. But he also felt that there should be a focus on manual trades, agricultural trades, things that could be taught to an enslaved population, and that, that Blacks should establish an economic beachhead. And in time, that would bring Blacks to a certain level where they would be more naturally accepted socially, fully. He also felt that as European immigration was peaking from Southern and Eastern Europe, or starting to peak around that time, the 1890s, through 1924, that Americans should prefer the recently freed Black people, that, go with the population, that
That
has
is
proven
interesting.
itself.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, they're very different. You can see these are very different ideologies. They were not necessarily mutually exclusive until 1903, which is just past the Gilded Age, when when W.E.B. Du Bois writes Souls of Black Folk. And that's when he frontally attacks Booker T. Washington, and he's just disgusted by this limited vision. And of course, what also had happened was that lynching was
Reemerged.
skyrocketing.
Yeah.
And so, he so then the ideological differences were formalized, especially with regard to education and integration. And then finally, it's sort of well known that Du Bois he was sort of an irascible guy, he wasn't going to back down. And Booker T. Washington was quiet, but firm and pretty nasty.
Mhm.
So
That
he,
is certainly
yeah,
a
yeah.
good movie in the making, I believe. We don't have very many minutes left, but I do want to ask you about a book that maybe you'll touch on during your lecture, Lord, Please Don't Take Me in August, which deals with Saratoga and with Newport. And would you tell us a little bit about what you mean with that title, Lord, Please Don't Take Me in August?
Well, that was August was the height of the summer season. In this case, it was Saratoga Springs, because they have the races, and they still have the races. But I wanted to, first of all, capture a voice of one of the members of the Black community in these resort towns. And so I interviewed a woman who had lots of memories of growing up in Saratoga, and had also lived in New England. And she felt that life was best for Black people in the summertime in these resort towns. So that's what I capture there. But what I was
So
trying,
what you mean is not, don't take me away from Saratoga
yes, she was actually.
did you mean don't let me die?
Exactly. Well, I meant both,
Okay.
it was sort of funny, because her father was an AME minister. So the family every 3 years had a different parish. And she, at some point when they got to Saratoga, the mother just said, "We're not moving anymore." And they didn't. The father, they stayed put. But what she was saying, in a religious sense, is, Lord, don't take me. I want to live.
Yeah.
But she also meant that I want to live at the height of the resort season. Life is best. Life is good. It's exciting. We're making money. They're socially, it was so stimulating for her, because the college students very often worked in these hotels. In Saratoga, for Newport, it would have been the steamboats, right? The steamships. And so there were deposits that these college student populations were making. They were exciting, and she was young, so life was good.
Sounds like it was good. Well, I have a list of about 25 more questions that I did not get to ask you, Dr. Armstead, but we are looking forward to seeing you here in Newport on the 6th of June. It's a 6 o'clock lecture at Rosecliff. It's on our website, so we hope that those who have listened and are interested will visit and come and join us on the 6th of June. Thank you